So I'd like to hand off this evening to our moderator, who is NWAC's own outreach coordinator, Renee Shapiro. We're excited to welcome Renee to the team this past summer. So Renee, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thanks so much, Scott. And thank you all for joining us for this final evening of NSAW 2020. We have a really wonderful lineup of speakers for this evening, and our first presenter is Pascal Haegli. Pascal is an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, where he holds the NSERC Industrial Research Chair in Avalanche Risk Management. He manages a team of 10 grad students with whom he conducts applied research at the interface between the natural and social sciences to help recreationalists and avalanche professionals make better decisions. Today, Pascal will be sharing information from a series of studies to better understand backcountry users' avalanche bulletin perceptions, skills, and practices. Data from the NWAC community has been used in this study, so I'm really looking forward to hearing this presentation called Everything You Wanted to Know About Bulletin Users But Were Afraid to Ask. Thanks, Pascal, and go ahead and take it away. Pascal, you're still muted. You want to unmute?
Here we go.
Great.
Can everybody hear me now? You would think by now I would know how this works, but happens almost every time. Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for tuning in tonight. It's really exciting to be here. My research group and I have had the pleasure to be part of NSAW over the last few years, and so you might have actually already heard a bit about our research on avalanche forecast users. So over the next 15 minutes, I'm gonna give you an update over the latest results of our research in this area. So as we all know, the job of the avalanche forecast is to summarize the information about the current conditions in a way that recreationalists can make informed decisions about when and where to go into the backcountry. A lot of the research in our community aims to help produce better forecasts, but the focus of our research is to better understand what end users actually do with this information. The big challenge for avalanche forecasts is that our audience is highly diverse with different backgrounds, objectives, and skills for putting the available information into action. So there are many different ways our forecast products are and can be used. So our overarching research questions are: how do recreationalists use, understand, and apply bulletin information? Does the provided information match with users' needs and expectations? And what are common hurdles and challenges? And our goal is to produce results that can highlight opportunities for making it more accessible and useful for everybody. So to address these research questions, we're using a wide range of different social science methods. Initially, we conducted qualitative interviews to get an overview of different forecast user types. And in the last 2 winters, we ran large online surveys to get a more complete overview of how backcountry users use avalanche forecasts in North America. And so at this point, I would really like to say a very big thank you to the NWAC community. As Renee said, your participation in these surveys were just unbelievable, and you've given us an incredible amount of data to explore interesting research questions. So really a big thank you to all that have participated. Now, the rich data set that we've got from you has been the foundation for a whole series of studies. At last year's NSAW, my student Henry Finn already talked about Anne Sinclair's Avalanche Bulletin user typology and his own research on Avalanche Bulletin literacy. If you want to learn more about their results, both Anne and Henry have recently published short articles in the Avalanche Review. And if you really want to know everything about it, you can check out their master theses on the website of our research group. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the work of Abby Morgan, who aims to identify challenges with the danger scale, and Katie Fisher's study, which examines whether different presentation formats can make avalanche problem information easier to use. So let's get started with Abby's work on the danger scale. Now, by design, the avalanche danger scale is not a linear, but an exponential scale, similar to the scales used for other natural hazards like earthquakes or hurricanes. The chart on the right, which was recently published by Jörg Schweitzer, shows the amount of avalanche activity in a small but well-monitored forecast region as a function of the local danger rating. The numbers at the top indicate how many forecast days are included in the box plots for each level, which nicely show that the increase is non-linear. As we go up on the scale, the difference in avalanche activity increases, giving the curve a concave shape. Several other studies have shown similar trends, and Bruce Tremper actually talks about this aspect of the danger scale in his book. Now, having an accurate understanding of the nature of the avalanche danger scale seems critical for making informed choices about backcountry travel. So we were curious to learn more about how recreationalists actually perceive this scale. So to examine the participant perception of the danger scale, our 2019 survey included a question with sliders that allowed participants to indicate what range of severities they associate with the different levels. We then used a so-called latent class regression analysis to identify typical patterns in participants' responses. Overall, we found 7 distinguishable patterns, but I'm just going to show 4 here. Just about half of the sample looked at the danger scale as a straight up linear scale with non-overlapping ranges. Another 13% perceived the scale to be fairly linear, but with a wider range for considerable. And approximately 20% believed that the danger scale has more of a convex shape, with the differences between the levels decreasing as we go up on the scale. In the end, only about 6% actually thought that the scale concave shape similar to what is shown in Jörg's chart. Interestingly, the group that identified the concave shape was rather random and not really associated with high levels of training or experience. Now, perception is just one thing, but even more important is how recreationalists integrate the danger rating into their trip planning process. To examine this question, we straight up asked participants how they use each danger rating level, and we gave them 4 different response options. At this danger level, I go primarily based on the danger rating. I go mainly based on the danger rating, but also check other info. At this level, avalanche problems and forecast details are the basis of my decision to go. And at this level, the danger rating alone prevents me from going into the backcountry. Here's what we found when looking at the sample as a whole. 91% stay at home at extreme, and 62% stay at home at both high and extreme. We also found that about a third interprets low as a green light for going into the backcountry without checking additional information, and only 5% do the same at moderate. Interestingly, the most dominant background variable that determined how participants answered this question was how many days per winter they spend in the backcountry. So how engaged they are in the activity. Avalanche awareness education played a secondary role, and somewhat surprising, participants' perception of the scale did not matter at all. So here are some of the key take-home messages that I take from the study. So we saw that most people perceive the danger scale to be linear, which is different from how avalanche researchers look at it. Interestingly, avalanche awareness did not make a difference in how people look at the scale. We also saw that about 2/3 of participants simply stay at home when the rating is high or extreme, so they don't distinguish between the two levels. Interesting here is that how people perceive the scale doesn't seem to affect how they use it to make basic trip planning decisions. So I hope you can see that getting insight into how recreationalists actually use our tools is critical for making them better. So the next step will be to work with avalanche centers and educators to figure out what exactly these results mean for us. For me, the big question is, does the danger scale do the best possible job communicating the conditions to the user that rely on the danger scale the most? Now let's move on to Katie's study, who is currently working on examining how the presentation of avalanche problem location information affects people's ability to use this information. To examine this question, we conducted another study, another online survey last spring, where we gave participants bulletin scenarios with 2 avalanche problems and asked them to rank the provided routes according to their exposure. We presented the location information in 3 different ways. In the Canadian style, with elevation and aspect information in separate graphics. In the US style, with each problem presented in a separate aspect elevation rows. And in a new style where all the information was combined into a single graphic. Participants were randomly assigned to one of the 3 presentation formats, and each of them completed 4 ranking tasks with different routes and avalanche conditions. After they completed the rankings, we also asked participants about their personal preferences for the different presentation formats. So in total, slightly over 3,000 people participated, completing roughly 12,000 ranking tasks. We then used a number of regression analyses to isolate the effect of the presentation format on the correctness of participants' route rankings, how long it took them to complete the tasks, and how much they like the presentation format. So how did this work out? Let's look at the chance of completing the ranking task correctly first. Everything else being equal, the chance of completing the task correctly was roughly 8 percentage points higher for participants who were presented with the American graphic. There was no significant difference between the Canadian and the new graphic. So we have a clear winner in this category. With respect to completion time, participants were presented with the American or new graphic were roughly 10 seconds faster than if they were given the Canadian graphic. We take this result to mean that combining the elevation and aspect information takes considerable mental effort, whereas combining the information of the 2 different problems together is much easier. So here we have 2 winners, and the Canadian graphic is a distant third. In our analysis on the preference ratings, we found several interactions, which means that how much people like the graphic depends on the interplay with other variables. For example, Americans really liked their own graphic, whereas Canadians liked their graphic equally well as the American, but just overall on a lower level. Which graphic participants used during the route ranking exercise also mattered. Overall, participants liked the American graphic the best, but the difference to the other graphics was smaller among participants who used the other graphics in the exercise. Finally, we found an interesting pattern with avalanche training. Again, the American icon was consistently rated highest by all training levels, but the preference for the new graphic was dependent on participants' training level. Participants with less training liked it more, and participants with professional level training liked it considerably less. So here again, overall, the American graphic is clearly the most preferred. So let's briefly summarize these results. The American graphic is the clear winner as it outperformed the other graphics in all aspects. The race for second was tight, but the new graphic prevailed due to the faster completion time, which we interpret as it being easier to process. Another important result of our analysis is that people generally like what they're used to. So if you're planning to change the information presentation in your forecast, you should be ready for some resistance. Now, these results probably mean that we have a little bit of work to do in Canada, but more generally, they highlight that design really matters and that research like this can really help to make our products better. I hope you enjoyed this whirlwind tour of our latest research on avalanche risk communication. Thanks again for taking the time to participate in our surveys. I know they can be quite long, so I really appreciate you taking the time. But your participation is really key for helping us better understand who you are, what works for you, and even more importantly, what doesn't work for you. We will continue this research, and so stay tuned for more results and future requests for participating in another survey. And please remember that you don't have to be an expert for participating in our studies. We really want to hear from everybody. Also, big thanks to all the different agencies that helped in the funding, design, and promotion of our surveys. If you have any questions about these studies or our research in general, feel free to email me. You can see my email address on the screen here, or you can check out our website at avalancheresearch.ca. If we still have time, I'm happy to take a question or two.
Thanks, Pascal, for a really fascinating presentation. I remember personally filling out this survey, and it's really fascinating to see how avalanche professionals reconcile what they understand based on how recreationists understand that. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I know many people do. We have time for a few questions, so I'm going to feed you a couple that are coming in from our community. The first by Daryl asks if avalanche graphs from other countries were considered, and just curious about Europe, Japan, etc.
Yes, that's a great question. We did not consider other designs. We did a big sort of survey at the beginning just to see what's all out there. And it seems that the design of most countries sort of falls into these 2 to 3 categories. Sort of either aspect and elevation are separate. Switzerland would be another country where that's the case. And then the aspect elevation rows that you guys have is quite popular, like New Zealand has that format as well. So we sort of stuck with those 3 main designs. And so there's 2 general designs, and then we came up with the third one by ourselves, which I was disappointed that it wasn't more successful.
Thanks for that answer. That's great. Allison from the audience is wondering, how did the different forecast diagrams impact accuracy in the terrain selection exercise?
So it was that the American graphic resulted in the most correct rankings. And then the Canadian and the new design were second. We were sort of expecting that the American would perform better than the Canadian, simply because it's when you do the exercise, it's quite hard to combine aspect and elevation information together. We were a little bit surprised that the new design resulted in more errors, because personally I thought that it would be much easier to see in there sort of where you can thread the needle, where you can avoid all avalanche problems. But apparently I was wrong with that. So we'll have to do more research on why exactly that was the case.
That's fascinating. Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. Lynn Wang is wondering if color blindness was taken into account when the new graphic was designed. Yes,
we did take color blindness into consideration and chose those two colors so that colorblind people could separate them out. We also had a question in the survey about color blindness so that we can control for that in the analysis. In the end, it didn't make any difference in our analysis.
Awesome. And our final question is from Heidi. She is wondering, how do you account for the learning curve of using an unfamiliar design? Perhaps the reason why the design you created for the survey had the results it did.
Yes, that is a possibility. And we took that into account by including in the analysis which country that people come from. And so we had a variable in the analysis that basically accounted for familiarity with the existing tool. And there you could clearly see that there is better performance with people that are familiar with that particular graphic. But your point is completely valid. Like this was really something brand new, and it might take a little while for people to pick up on it. That's opportunity for a future study again.
Thanks, Pascal. And this is a question I have personally related to one of your last findings about how familiarity is a big hangup in the process of changing, perhaps for the better. As a person working in an Avalanche Center, what is a good next step for making sure that these great changes can be implemented in a way that the community will appreciate?
That's a very good question. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for this. And I think it's really like, I don't feel I have all of the necessary information as a researcher to really give you a good answer for that. And I think we just need to come together as a community. So as educators, avalanche forecasting centers, and researchers to sort of have these discussions about where exactly do we want to go and what do these results really mean, and how can we change our systems in a way that does help people to make that transition in a meaningful way. Because yeah, it's a hard thing to do, and we don't want to do this too often. And so when we do it, we want to make it well informed and really in the right direction.
Thanks so much, Pascal. Really appreciate your time and your presentation this evening.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, and a great start to the winter to everybody.